a brother in conviction. With these three words, the young president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, stunned the world. His tribute to American activist Charlie Kirk did not just surprise, it shook audiences across continents, igniting curiosity, respect, and debate. Why would a leader from West Africa speak so personally about a figure from the American conservative movement? The answer, as it turned out, was bound to unfold on a stage far from Ouagadougou in Washington, D.C. The story begins on what was supposed to be an ordinary evening at Utah Valley University. Students filled the hall, waiting to hear Charlie Kirk deliver one of his familiar talks on freedom, faith, and the values he believed defined America. But in a heartbeat, normalcy shattered. A gunshot cracked through the air. Panic swept the room, screams, chaos, and confusion. Security scrambled, but the damage was irreversible. Charlie Kirk, just 31 years old, collapsed to the floor. His microphone rolled away, the faint echo of its impact cutting through the stunned silence. Cameras broadcasting the event captured the unthinkable, and within minutes, headlines began to spread. By morning, the nation was in mourning. "Charlie Kirk, dead at 31," blared across screens. Grief cut through political lines. Flags were lowered, churches opened, and communities gathered to process the loss. Even those who often clashed with Kirk's views found themselves united in shock. Beyond the rhetoric, there was the raw reality. A husband lost, a father taken too soon, and a family left to grieve. For many, America itself felt wounded. And then came the unexpected. Thousands of miles away, President Ibrahim Traoré issued a statement. To most Americans, his name was unfamiliar, yet his words carried weight. He called Kirk his brother in conviction. It was not the sort of diplomatic condolence one expects from a head of state. Instead, it was deeply personal, so much so that commentators immediately asked, what connection existed between these two men from such different worlds? The question only grew louder as news broke that Traoré would attend the memorial service in Washington. His presence was as surprising as his words. Analysts debated endlessly. Was this a symbolic political gesture, an attempt to position himself on the global stage, or was there a deeper, more personal reason? As the day of the memorial drew near, Washington prepared for a moment of gravity and scrutiny. Streets filled with security vehicles, military bands rehearsed solemn marches, and the cathedral hosting the service was draped in white. The front rows reserved for Kirk's grieving family were soon flanked by dignitaries and leaders from around the world. When journalists caught Traoré's name on the official list, whispers spread like wildfire. Why had he come? And more importantly, what could he possibly say that would resonate in this room, heavy with grief under the eyes of the world? The morning of the memorial dawned gray and cold in Washington, D.C., a city draped in silence, bracing itself for a moment the world would not soon forget. Candles flickered outside the cathedral as mourners held photos of Charlie Kirk close to their chests. Police cordons sealed off the streets while news crews jostled for position, waiting to capture what was already being called a historic gathering. Inside, the cathedral's air felt heavy, as though grief itself had taken a seat among the rows of white-draped chairs. Then the motorcade pulled up. From it emerged Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso. No grand entourage, no ceremonial pomp, just a man in a plain dark suit walking slowly toward the entrance. The sight was enough to spark a wave of whispers. What was he doing here so far from home, stepping into America's mourning? He bowed his head gently toward Kirk's family as he reached the front pew. Flashbulbs lit up the moment. A foreign leader, unknown to many in the room, now part of one of America's most painful days. At first, his presence seemed no more than a gesture of respect. Few knew he had come with words that would leave an indelible mark. The service began in solemn rhythm. A choir's hymn rose softly like fragile threads of prayer, winding through the stained glass light. From the pulpit, U.S. leaders, senators, pastors, and friends of Kirk shared their grief. His widow clutched her children tightly, tears streaking her cheeks. while the weight of every speech deepened the sorrow in the room. And then came the announcement. We now invite His Excellency Ibrahim Traoré, President of the Transition of Burkina Faso, to speak. The crowd stirred. A ripple of disbelief passed through the hall. Who was this young African leader, and why was he given the microphone at such a deeply American memorial? Traoré rose. No papers in his hands, no prepared notes, only the steady sound of his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. His gaze was fixed, unwavering. As he turned toward Kirk's widow and children, the cathedral hushed to absolute silence. "Madam," he began, his voice quiet but resolute, "your husband's blood was not shed in vain. His voice still echoes, not only here but across Africa as well." The words struck the room like a bell. He paused, letting them breathe. "In Burkina Faso," he continued, his tone sharpening, "too many mothers bury their sons. Too many children wait for fathers who never return." Now his voice carried weight, resonating against the cathedral walls. "Today I stand here not as one man, not even as one president, but as the voice of all nations that still believe truth is worth dying for." For the first time, the mourning shifted. The memorial was no longer just about one man, one family, or one country. It became a global moment. Traoré's tribute transformed Kirk's death into a universal reflection on freedom, suffering, and the cost of conviction. "I know the sting of bullets," he pressed on, his tone both firm and vulnerable. "In my country, young men are hunted because they dare to dream of liberty. Charlie Kirk dreamed too. That is why his death is not only America's loss, it is Africa's loss. It is humanity's loss." A wave of emotion swept the cathedral. Some whispered in astonishment, others bowed their heads in reverence. Kirk's widow clutched her children even tighter as tears flowed anew. From the back of the hall, a student whispered words that seemed to echo the collective sentiment. "He understands us more than our own leaders." What Ibrahim Traoré did that day went far beyond offering condolences. He stepped into the grief of strangers and made it his own, transforming the memorial into a moment of global unity. His voice carried not as that of a foreign president, but as a man speaking for every nation that had suffered loss and violence. In the silence that followed his opening words, it felt as though time itself had paused. Reporters froze mid-sentence, unsure whether to scribble in their notebooks or simply bear witness. The weight of Traoré's presence was undeniable. His demeanor suggested he carried something urgent, something the world needed to hear. Leaning into the podium, he took a deep breath. His tone shifted from gentle tribute to unflinching honesty. "I must speak truthfully," he declared. "When a voice is destroyed by violence, the killer is not alone. Hatred itself, the society that allows hatred to grow, is also guilty." A sharp intake of breath echoed across the hall. No one had expected such blunt words in this setting. Fixing his gaze on the cameras, Traoré continued with intensity. "In Africa, too many leaders with courage have been silenced by foreign hands. And here in America, too many of your own fall because you fail to protect those who dare to speak freely." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Some bowed their heads, others clasped their hands tightly, visibly shaken by the directness of his critique. Even Donald Trump, seated in the front rows, was moved into a rare stillness. What had begun as a memorial was transforming into a reckoning, a mirror lifted toward America itself. The audience sat frozen, caught between grief and the uncomfortable weight of Traoré's challenge. Then his voice softened, but his words carried even greater gravity. "I did not come here only to mourn. I came to deliver something important." The air grew taut. Journalists leaned forward, cameras adjusted, every eye locked on him. Charlie Kirk's widow, red-eyed and trembling, looked up, bracing for whatever was about to come. "Before he died, Charlie Kirk sent me a letter," Traoré announced. The cathedral seemed to gasp as one. No one, not even Kirk's closest friends, had spoken of such a letter. The revelation electrified the hall. Slowly, Traoré reached inside his jacket and drew out a folded sheet of paper. His hands quivered slightly as he opened it, and the faint crackle of the paper filled the silence like a drum beat. All eyes were fixed on him as he raised the letter and began to read. If these words are being spoken aloud, it means I am gone. But remember this, my fight was never for me. It was for my children, for the students who listened, for the future of a country I loved more than my own life. A sob broke from Kirk's widow, piercing the stillness. Tears fell freely throughout the hall as Traoré paused, visibly struggling with his own emotion. This was no longer a memorial in the traditional sense. It was a moment that bridged nations, values, and histories. The grief of one family had become the grief of an entire world. The camera zoomed closer, capturing every detail of the trembling letter in Traoré's hands, the weight in his eyes, and the solemn silence that engulfed the room. He drew another breath, preparing to continue. There is more, Traoré said softly, his tone heavy with warning. And it is harder still to bear. The cathedral seemed to lean forward as one. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every breath suspended in the thick air. Traoré's eyes moved carefully across the page, as though weighing each line before releasing it into the silence. Charlie Kirk had written, "If I fall, do not let anger devour you. Do not allow bitterness to poison what I lived for. Tell my children that their father did not die out of hatred for this world, but because he loved it enough to give everything he had." The words spread through the hall like fire and ash, consuming the mourners in equal measure of grief and awe. This was no call for vengeance. It was an affirmation of love. Love for family, for country, for the possibility of a better tomorrow. Suddenly, Kirk's death was no longer just a political tragedy. It became something larger, a testament to the cost of conviction. The cathedral trembled in its stillness. Mothers pulled their children close, instinctively shielding them from the weight of the truth. Fathers lowered their heads, burdened by a quiet shame, realizing how little most had sacrificed compared to what had just been revealed. At the front, Kirk's widow bent forward, her voice breaking as she whispered to her children, "He loved you. He loved you so much." The pew around her shook as tears streamed down faces. Even the press, those trained to observe with detachment, could not contain their emotions. One reporter dropped her pen to the floor, covering her face with her hands as she sobbed openly. Traoré pressed on, though his own voice began to falter under the weight of the words. "If I cannot return home, let others rise, and rise with courage, not fear." For a moment he stopped. His eyes closed tightly, his lips pressed as though fighting to hold back his own grief. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that makes even stone walls feel alive with sorrow. When he finally opened his eyes again, the letter trembled in his hands. "This last passage," he said, his voice low but resolute, "is the reason I stand here before you today." Every person in the hall straightened, bracing themselves. Charlie's final words read, "If I am silenced, do not look only at the man who pulled the trigger. Look to those who gave him cause, the ones who spread the hatred, the ones who profit from suppressing voices like mine." The gasp that swept across the cathedral was almost physical. Some clutched the wooden pews as if anchoring themselves against a storm. Kirk's widow shook violently, her knuckles white as she gripped the bench in front of her, straining to stay upright. The implication was undeniable. This was not just about one gunman. It was about a system, a climate of hostility, perhaps even a network that thrived on division. Slowly, with deliberate care, Traoré folded the letter and pressed it against his chest. His eyes were firm, but grief weighed heavily in them. "This is not merely Charlie's farewell," he declared. "This is his warning. And I swore to him that if this moment ever came, I would carry his words into the world without fear." The silence that followed was suffocating, charged with both sorrow and revelation. Tears fell freely, hands clenched in unease, and whispers began to ripple like cracks in the stone floor. The memorial had transformed into something else entirely, Not just mourning, but a reckoning with truths long buried. At the center of it all, Kirk's widow clutched her children tightly, her shoulders shaking under the unbearable weight of both loss and legacy. From the back of the cathedral, a young man suddenly leapt to his feet, tears streaking down his face. His voice rang out, raw and unfiltered. "He's right. We have to listen." The cry cut through the heavy silence, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. Security guards instinctively moved forward, unsure whether to quiet him, but they stopped as the crowd began to stir. Instead of outrage, there was agreement. Heads nodded. Sobs grew louder. People weren't resisting Traoré's words. They were being awakened by them. At the rear of the hall, television commentators locked eyes, recognizing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Their voices faltered as cameras captured the tears, the gasps, the trembling hands pressed against beating hearts. It felt as if the nation itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable yet unprecedented to unfold. Traoré stood silently, allowing the power of the moment to linger. He did not rush to fill the air. He had just delivered Charlie Kirk's final message, and its weight was still sinking in. The cathedral seemed alive, pulsing with collective grief and revelation. Finally, raising one hand for quiet, he spoke again. Calm, deliberate, steady. "What you choose to do with this truth is not mine to decide. But I swore to your brother, your father, your husband, that I would not allow his voice to be buried. Today, I keep that promise." The words struck deeper than any political manifesto ever could. They were not the remarks of a foreign leader lecturing a nation, but of a man carrying another's final plea. "In my homeland," Traoré continued, his voice growing heavy with sorrow, "we bury young men every week. Mothers cry out in the streets, battling against forces larger than themselves. And here, in the mightiest country in the world, you too bury your sons. Tell me, does the life of a child in Burkina Faso mean less than the life of a child in America? No. We share the same tears, we whisper the same prayers." The words melted barriers. For the first time, many in the audience did not see Africa as a faraway continent, but as a mirror of their own anguish. Traoré was not dividing them. He was binding them together with a truth that stretched across oceans. Grief speaks one language. When he finally stepped away from the podium, the cathedral shook with the intensity he had unleashed. A silence, vast and eternal, fell like a cloak over the room. It was no longer merely a memorial, it had become a reckoning, a communion of sorrow and solidarity. Reporters struggled to keep up, their pens slipping as tears blurred the words on their notepads. The widow rose shakily, her hand pressed against her chest. Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried through the hall. "Thank you." Her children clung to her side, their faces pale with grief but also touched by something greater, as though their father's spirit had been carried through Traoré himself. The audience responded not with cheers but with reverence. Some stood, offering slow, deliberate applause. Others dropped to their knees, overcome by the weight of what had been shared. Tears streaked the polished marble floor, while outside crowds gathered before giant screens. They began to chant Charlie's name, first softly, then louder, until it thundered across Washington. In that moment, the memorial ceased to be confined to one building. It became a citywide cry, a national lament, a collective awakening. No one knew yet how the debates to come would shape politics, or what conflicts these revelations might ignite. But one truth was certain: history had just been written. Ibrahim Traoré had entered quietly, almost anonymously. He left as the custodian of a message that could not be buried, a voice that would echo far beyond the walls of that cathedral. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped away from the podium, a profound hush lingered over the cathedral. The applause that rose was not celebratory, it was reverent, heavy with respect. There were no cheers, no outward displays of triumph. Instead, strangers embraced one another, whispered prayers, and clung together in grief. Outside, the streets of Washington reverberated with the crowd's chant of Charlie's name. their voices carrying upward into the cold sky. News networks rushed to air the speech, replaying its most powerful moments across every channel. Some anchors, their voices cracking, struggled to continue live broadcasts. In cities far beyond the capital, Dallas, New York, Chicago, vigils sprang up spontaneously. Candles glowed in the night, illuminating faces streaked with tears. Across the ocean, in villages and towns in Burkina Faso, families huddled around radios and televisions, grieving for a man they had never known but now felt connected to. On social media, tributes spread like wildfire. "I never imagined I'd cry like this," one post read. "Traoré spoke the truth we all needed to hear." What had begun as a quiet memorial had transformed into something unthinkable, a wave of shared mourning that spanned continents. After the ceremony, away from cameras, Charlie Kirk's widow requested a private audience with Traoré. In a quiet room behind the cathedral, she stood trembling, her children pressed close against her. Through tears, she whispered, "You gave my husband back to me. Through your words, you returned him to us. Thank you." Traoré bowed deeply, his voice low but steady. "No," he said gently. "It is I who thank him. His courage lives beyond death. My hope is that his children grow knowing they are never truly fatherless. The world carries his name now." For a moment, they clasped hands in silence. A photographer, unnoticed in the corner, captured the image. The widow, her children, and Traoré standing together in prayer. That photograph would soon circle the globe, becoming a symbol of human connection in the midst of unbearable grief. To the family, this encounter was not about politics. It was about healing, about dignity in the face of loss, about finding strength in shared sorrow. That stillness became its own testimony. Even in the darkest hours, compassion and love endure. By week's end, America was still processing what had happened inside that cathedral. In classrooms, teachers replayed clips of Traoré's words. Pastors wove his message into sermons. Politicians debated its implications for the future. But ordinary people felt something deeper. The tragedy was no longer just another headline. It had become a call to courage, a reminder that truth and justice demand sacrifice. And across both America and Africa, prayers were whispered not only for Charlie's family, but also for Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who carried a fallen man's voice with grace and conviction. What the world had witnessed was not merely a memorial. It was a turning point. Traoré had reminded America of truths it had almost forgotten. Years from now, the question would still be asked. Do you remember the day Traoré read Charlie's letter? The memory would not fade. Neither would the legacy of Charlie Kirk, whose final words transcended borders and bound two worlds together. If this story touched you, if it stirred something in your heart, help keep it alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your reflections in the comments. Let us prove together that truth and love are stronger than silence. Your voice matters. Carry it forward.